Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You campaigned for it, you fought for it, you voted for it, and now it has arrived. Change begins now.
Welcome to another special edition of the Voternomics podcast, where politics and markets collide. I'm Stephanie Flanders, Head of Economics and Government at Bloomberg, and I'm in Whitehall in the old War Office, just a stone's throw from 10 Downing Street, if you're much better at throwing stones than I am. The Conservatives, just a review, have been turfed out in a seismic changing of the guard in Westminster and across constituencies up and down the land, with Prime Minister Rishi Sunak presiding over a record loss of around 250 Conservative seats, Labour with a majority just shy of Tony Blair's landslide victory of 1997. And there will be a lot of other new faces joining him in Parliament, including many more Liberal Democrats, a clutch of Reform and Green MPs. We'll be very interested in 5 years' time to see what kind of opposition the Labour Party is facing. But I think it's fair to say, for the first time in a long time, the world, here in the financial markets and in London, but also around the world, doesn't have to pay that much attention to the Conservative Party's travails, at least for a while, any more than they ever care about a weak opposition party at the start of a new government with a massive majority. So instead, we'll be focusing here on Labour, and markets haven't reacted this morning. You'll probably have seen, and I think Con mentioned, there's been no big change in the pound. FTSE's up slightly when it opened a few minutes ago. And that's obviously because it wasn't a surprise that the Labour Party had won. But I think, they've been so cagey and so careful in the lead up to this with their huge lead in the polls that they didn't want to lose, that I think there will be plenty in the months to come that will be a surprise for investors and for the business community and for all of us. Here up on the stage, I have to help me think about this for the next few minutes, Bloomberg's editor-in-chief, John Micklethwait, and Sir Nigel Wilson, who was the chief executive of the insurer Legal & General for a decade before standing down last year, and has recently been appointed group chairman of Canary Wharf Group. So Nigel, let me come to you because along with your business career, you've been quite public over the years about the factors holding back the UK economy and the shortcomings in government policy over this period. Do you seriously expect now that Labour will change things, and what kind of advice would you give them?
I'm very excited because I think Keir's done an amazing job to transform the party and win the election, and he's now got a wonderful opportunity because, as I've always said, we've got an amazing amount of capital in the UK. We've got £6 trillion of long-term capital, which has been hopelessly misallocated for the last 20 or 30 years. So they've got the capital already sitting in the UK to do all the necessary changes, because we're always bottom of the G7 table in terms of a percentage of investment as a proportion of GDP. We could now move to near the top of it if we want to do that, and they put the policy and regulation in place to drive growth in housing, and to drive growth in sort out the water industry, the massive transformation on energy, and to build a world-class venture capital and scale-up businesses in the UK. So I'm very excited about the prospects, because Keir's done a great job in phase one, which I think is the easiest one, is winning the election. Phase two is actually coming forward with some, not cagey policies, but some real credible policies about how we're really going to grow the economy and use all the private capital and all the private expertise to drive that growth, and then be very supportive next year in actually making sure that capital gets spent and the government acts in a very bold and aggressive way that they haven't done for a very long period of time to really drive change. Don't just talk about change, you've got to make change happen. So I think they are listening. I've had lots of, and indeed some private sessions with Keir on this, and I think they're up for doing this. This could be 1945, a transformation of the economy going forward, a modernisation of the economy going forward, and really, really delivering and making people happy again about the terrible lack of growth that we've seen since 2007 and how far behind, we've fallen against the best of our competitors.
Well, yeah, just to follow up on that, I mean, I think people outside the world are surprised that we have a world-leading financial sector it's so good at deploying capital, but historically for more than a century has been bad at deploying it in its own country. We haven't seen it go into the kind of private investment. And as you mentioned, 24 of the last 30 years, we've had the lowest rate of investment in the group of 7, and we're about 28th out of 31 countries in the OECD. So when you talk about, so Keir Starmer, the incoming Prime Minister, knows what's at stake and knows some of the key levers to pull. What have you focused on planning restrictions, on house building? Where would you see it?
I think all of these things are integrated together, because I think once you start delivering change and people seeing things happen, then you create that amazing positive momentum. They've done it in the election. I think they can do it in the economy as well, because the numbers that you quote are often the ones that I quote as well. We have this massive potential. There's £6 trillion of long-term capital. There's £3 trillion in the pension fund industry. There's £1.5 trillion in the insurance industry, 750 billion sitting in various savings schemes, and ISAs have 750 billion as well. That's 6 trillion hopelessly deployed. And we've got some of the cleverest, best bankers in the world. And as you said, they're world leading. We now have to get them working with industry and actually under the sponsorship and leadership of the government to really make a difference. And planning, initially, they've got to use the powers they already have, compulsory purchase orders, call-in rights, and then put in place legislation which allows them to really drive growth in the energy industry, in the housing industry, in the water industry, but also in all these amazing scale-up businesses that we have across the UK. So they actually do scale up. They do IPO here in the UK. And we look in 2 or 3 years' time and say, wow, all these amazing things have happened here in the UK.
John Micklethwait.
Can I ask something? Is that we all know planning is one huge area where things could change dramatically. The other gigantic one is Europe, which you didn't mention, but that, a bit like Keir Starmer has not mentioned, or he's tried not to mention it. But if you were looking, just from a straightforward economist's point of view, about how to grow the British economy, a new deal with Europe, and one which went perhaps quite close to a customs union, is that the other lever he could pull in order to get these things happening?
Yes, I think that's an excellent question. I would agree with everything you said there, John, that it's something we should be doing. There's a bit of chaos in Europe at the moment, and we've got these domestic priorities where we can actually deliver on them without wasting too much time. Literally next week they could start delivering.
But in order to get the most growth out of Europe,
yes, I totally agree with you.
Need to start early,
I mean, I would be in favour of a customs union, but clearly that's not the position that Keir and the rest of the team have right now. But actually, they get momentum in the domestic economy. That will create confidence in actually going forward and developing a much firmer and better relationship with Europe, which I think we would all cheer for.
I guess the pushback to some of this optimism, although obviously it is exciting and it's great to hear the kind of confidence and the optimism in your voice, Nigel. The just two things that we've identified that could make a difference are the just two things that have caused the most problem for successive UK governments pushing through difficult investment projects or big infrastructure investment, redeploying capital in the savings industry. I mean, people have been trying to do this for many years. Many, including Jeremy Hunt, have talked about it. And equally, Europe has just sucked so much time and political capital over the years without necessarily, would take quite a lot for this incoming government to decide to deploy it there. So isn't that the two things that we've talked about are actually incredibly hard, and they could look very bogged down very quickly?
I think that's not going to be the case, because I was very pleased, by the way, that Jeremy kept his seat, because he did a lot of work on pension reform. He's a really good person, and he stood up when we really needed somebody to stand up. And I think Rachel's going to be the same, is that she's going to try to make things happen and at pace. And so we know what the past looked like, and we don't want a repeat of that. Therefore, we've got to really drive change through very, very quickly. And there's so many easy wins. There's a stock of housing projects just stuck in planning, and you can accelerate that. It's a choice. You can select whether do we go faster or slower. We all want to go faster on things like that. And once that starts happening, doors lead to doors, and we'll see more good things happening right now, because there's a goodwill towards the party.
Are you so confident these things are going to happen because you're going to be in charge of doing them?
No,
Should I just check?
I
Because you have been talked about as a...
I'm certainly very close to lots of the mayors across and I'm a great believer in devolution. And indeed, I'd already set up some meetings post the election to talk to them about what else we can do to accelerate the growth, be that in Newcastle or Sunderland or
But if
wherever.
Sir Keir calls up in a few hours and said, you know what,
No, I don't
Nigel, can you help us with this?
I think he's got bigger issues to worry about than what I'm going to do for the next few months. But he's got a good team around him, and that team's talked up their capability. Now they have to deliver on that capability, and they've got the money. And as you rightly said, we've got a brilliant financial services sector, almost the envy of the world. We're brilliant in PE, we're brilliant in VC, we've got tons of savings, we've got masses of great banks here in the City of London. We've got huge underinvestment, as you pointed out, for the last 30 years. There's so many easy wins. Make them happen.
If I was you, imagine you did get that job, I would be rather worried by some of the seats that Labour has just won. You know, all these things like Aldershot. These are all the places where the Tories have faced endless problems over planning because people object to it. They don't like it. There's that film studio near Marlow, which even people like George Osborne say it's insane not to build it. It's the 3,000 jobs, 200 acres, but because it's just on the edge of the green belt, people don't want it. You are now going to have in Labour a group of MPs, which never had before, who after a few hours of self-congratulation, they're standing in face the prospect. They've got constituents who don't like new houses. There could be another wing of the Labour Party which actually makes life more difficult than easy for all the things you want to do.
I think that's a possibility, but when I was at Legal & General, we did the Sky Studios at Elstree, which is in a, not quite the green belt, but it's in an area that was difficult to achieve planning on. But once people see these things and they become up and running, and you can take people across the country and say, look, this is what happened here. This is the outcome. Don't be fearful about it. This is the rights of our children to have housing. Our generation is stolen from our children by not giving them the housing, by charging them for going to universities, by not giving them good pensions, all the things that we took for granted. We have to replace that by doing a better job for them going forward. And education's on that list as well, which I know is something you feel very strongly about.
In a minute, I want to get on to sort of pulling back in the lens in terms of where this victory, what it looks like in a global context and what that means for Keir Starmer as a new Prime Minister. But I guess, for the audience that is the business community, for investors around the world, very important to get stability. And I think that is why there was confidence around this. There was a positive reaction to this, just the prospect of a 5-year stable majority government. The good things that they might do that we've talked about to unlock investment and growth. But of course, with any Labour government, you also have the question of what bad things are we hoping they don't do. One query has been, given that they're not going to have very much money to play with, what often then happens is that you change laws instead of spending money, because you can do sweeping things by changing, for example, employment law, maybe eating away a bit at the sort of flexible hire and fire structure of the UK in ways that have unexpectedly quite negative effects for growth and for business confidence. So how worried should people be about that? Because that was where there was a bit of detail in the manifesto.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that's what's happened over the last 30 years. We made all these marginal decisions which look, when you're making them, as though they're positive, but actually when you look at the second order effects and the unintended consequences have been very negative for the overall economy and people's thinking about what a great place the UK is to invest. That's why they have to have some early wins on the positive growth story. So they're definitely changing the narrative and not spending all of their time causing things which are a problem for business.
But is there anything in that manifesto on that front that you would worry about? Like,
well, I think everyone's going to worry. Yeah, I think
things?
the workers' rights issues are going to be an issue that people are going to have to be concerned about. And it's not going to be plain sailing, given the composition of the Labour Party, and that is a risk. That is definitely a risk. So you're right to highlight that as a risk. And I've been on the other side of that, where I've been overly optimistic about things and then gone, just really let me down again. And that's happened so much in the past. But I think the towns and the cities across the UK have very capable people in them now as well. The banks themselves have moved to Birmingham, to Leeds, to Manchester, to Newcastle, and that's having a difference because suddenly capital is on tap. ambitions on tap. The mayors themselves are very ambitious people and very capable people.
Well, that is clearly going to be the ultimate test. They've talked a lot about decentralising, and I certainly be someone who thinks, I agree with you, that it's the best way now, given where we are, to make things happen, is to be devolving more power to regions and to cities in particular. But whether, so many governments say that, and then they get power, they don't want to relinquish it. So we'll see what happens. John, I think, you're someone who is flitting around the world quite a lot. Well, we do all the work, she says.
Is that your job, the flit?
I flit while Sir Stephen works.
It was not a surprise in the UK context at all, and it comes after 14 years of Conservative rule. But in a global context, this is completely out of step.
I think this is a big deal globally. I think that if you step back, I expect those of us who deal with America a lot will get a lot of calls later. Next week, you've got the summit where Starmer will go there, and suddenly this man who we were all describing was it seemed like a rather marginal figure in world politics, will suddenly be one of the most powerful people. Notwithstanding the fact, the kind of basket case nature of Britain in many ways, he will appear, and he is the one person next week who will be able to say, look, I'm here for the next 5 years. You look around the rest of the world, you've got Joe Biden, for whom the weekend may be a long time. You have Macron, who is in severe trouble. Olaf Scholz has also got issues. And from that perspective, you've got Keir Starmer, a very good Greek Prime Minister, good Italian Prime Minister, or Italian Prime Minister who's doing quite well. But Starmer is going to be right at the very centre of things with a degree of longevity. And I think that is actually really quite a big thing, and especially in the context of what's happening in other countries. And that degree of permanence is a very strange thing. And then secondly, he will be able to say, look, I'm the person who's managed to resist, or at least in theory, I've managed to resist these sort of nationalist currents which are happening elsewhere. And yes, people will come back at him and say, well, Reform did well. But that is not the same as what's happening in Paris. It's not the same as what's happening in Germany. And if you factor Donald Trump in, it's not the same as what's happening in America. So there will be, I think, amongst what might be described the centre ground of politics, there will also be a degree of Starmerism. So I completely agree, as I indicated, with the massive problems Starmer has got here. But actually, in a weird way, he's on the international stage. I think he is the first person since kind of Cameron or possibly Blair to have that degree of clout when it comes to the world politics.
I mean, I guess we don't know what's going to happen in France. We'll find out on Sunday night. But to the extent, as you say, we have the German Chancellor, French President Macron, very much on the back foot, potentially President Biden as well. I guess there's this danger, though, that they've invested all this time in those relationships that are not really going to be worth very much, and they're not going to be able to provide things that Labour or that the UK needs. So is that's the downside? I think one of the problems, which Nigel alluded to, is that the obvious thing, I think if all three of us, to make a terrible presumption, were put into Downing Street, I think redoing the relationship with Europe would be, that is the simple, easiest way to get the growth that Britain needs. And that none of the wonderful things that, or may not be wonderful to everybody, the things that Labour wants to do are going to be really possible without growth, because you have the gilts market sitting there looking at government spending. But the problem is, you go to Europe and it's a mess. And so the idea that Starmer can immediately get some degree of deal there, I think if I was Starmer, I would still try and do that rapidly, because I think it has two amazing effects for Starmer. Number one is it increases British growth. Secondly, it really skewers the Tories, because it probably pushes the Tories into a position where they oppose, no matter what happens, whatever deal he does come up with. And I think if they do that, I think I'll make a terrible presumption again about the nature of the people in this room, but I think the commercial classes in Britain, if the Tories again push themselves into a thing where they really limit growth,
I think that would be a very serious thing for the future of the Conservative Party.
I mean, if you look, sorry, Nigel.
I think we can change investor perception. That's the other thing, on the points that John's just made, is that because this will have financial and political stability for the next 5 years.
Yes,
this is, I've got a conscious bias. I think London's the best city in the world, and the UK is an amazing place to invest, and we've just underinvested in it for such a long time. Investor perception is going to change. The Conservatives did a really poor job of sort of country management across the world. We have an opportunity to put a lot of that right now, and there's tons of money elsewhere looking for homes. The world's awash with cash and capital at the moment, and we should be telling people this is a great place to come and invest that money, because you're going to have the political stability and economic growth agenda here, very pro-business, and these are great cities and towns to live in.
We're going to run out of time in a minute, but I guess I had two more words to ask you what your feelings were. Industrial policy. That's one of the ways in which the world has actually moved left in recent years in terms of economic policy, much more interventionism. Rachel Reeves has talked about Bidenomics without the money, or I guess she's not talked about it, but what she's said has implied Bidenomics without the money, because we don't have the kind of scale of trillions that the Biden administration has been able to put into things like the Inflation Reduction Act and infrastructure programs. But we may have Bidenomics without President Biden as well, but that's a whole other issue. But do you kind of have a natural kind of watch your wallet response when you start hearing about industrial policy? Do you worry about competition in that context? How should one welcome that?
I think we should welcome it, because I think there's going to be an engagement around what the industrial policy should be, because they've been actively listening for a very long time, and that's been very, very positive. And there is just this huge gap, and we have the capital. As John mentioned, the public finances are very constrained, and we'll find out just how constrained it is when they do their due diligence starting next week. Private sector capital is huge. The personal financial sector in the UK has a very strong, massive excess savings, really good shape. The SMEs in Britain, 190 billion of borrowings, 250 billion of deposits right now. So there's huge headroom for growth in the UK, but you have to have that confidence to invest. And I don't think we've had either the planning, the regulation, the policy, the tax situation, which has really encouraged investment. I was talking to the Tata Group about their investment in their EV battery factory yesterday. And Chandra is one of the most visionary leaders in the world, and they're going to make that happen. And seeing is believing. The Envision one up in Sunderland is absolutely fantastic. And if people get out and see what's happening, and the early green shoots, we've heard that before.
The cost per job is extraordinarily high, though. I mean, the kind of cost
I think that's a short-term view, and I think doors lead to doors. And we failed when we built the original Nissan factory. We haven't really done very much since to build the supply chain. We have to build supply chains in the UK, in part to trade with Europe.
We face this fundamental problem is that we decided, and again, Brexit is not the main issue, but the basic fact is that just at the moment when the world stopped being global, when it went to regional trade blocs, we are the people outside it. And when you talk about industrial policy, the comment about Bidenomics without the money is, you sit in anything and you look at Biden spends $1 trillion on green industry, and if we get 20 million, we think we're doing really well.
We could do over £100 billion of investment per year for the next 10 years just with the private sector money. And I have absolute confidence that all the projects are there, absolute confidence in the financial services sector to actually deliver that capital. And the economic growth that we'd get out of that would actually, in 5 years, sort out the public finance problem.
Isn't that interesting, though, that your version of Labour, which I think most people in this room would definitely support, that could end up being a more free market version of the left, broadly, than what's happening in America, what's happening in other places?
We're going to end, but I want to just ask both of you just a sort of simple question that comes out of the way this majority was won. And actually, it's a historically very small share of the vote for an extraordinary majority. I think it's the lowest ever share of the vote for the highest ever majority. So there's been a very sort of softly approach leading up to this, and even with this emphatic win, maybe some nervousness about how solid some of these seats are. Do you think Keir Starmer, both of you, do you think Keir Starmer is brave enough to really move the dial over the next few years and the next few months?
I think he is definitely brave enough to do it. He needs his other members of the cabinet to be bold and brave and actually use the powers that they have to really start to build momentum around economic growth. Because whilst public finances are poor, as John mentioned, the rest of the economy is in pretty good shape, and we have a lot of really good, capable people who are now in positions, rather like you. I think devolution is a great idea, and we should be doing more of it rather than less of it, and really build up our great cities outside of London as well.
I think intellectually, Starmer is in the right place in terms of the things you're talking about. I think the emotional side of it, the bit I worry about, is that his whole record is one of, on the whole, is gradualism. You know, he comes in, he changes things. Look at what he's done to Labour. It's an amazing feat. But he didn't do it all on day one. And the slight problem is when you go into government, that is as you know, it's a different challenge. You suddenly get thrown things and you have to make big decisions and you have to try to do them as early as possible because political capital is a bit, as George W. Bush once said, it's like an iceberg in the desert. It evaporates. And I think the more stuff that Starmer does early, Blair, tragically I'm old enough to remember that, Blair came in and he did a lot of things straight away. And that's where we get a very good indication of how bold Starmer really is, I think, quite soon.
Watch this space. Well, we have managed to talk all this time without really talking about the public finances or where the money is going to come from. But we spent so much time talking about that over the last few weeks, and I know there'll be plenty more discussions around that. So I'm very happy to have had this quite optimistic and quite detailed micro look at the challenges ahead for this government and whether they're up to them. Thank you for being here for our recording of Voternomics from the Old War Office in Whitehall as part of this Bloomberg UK election 2024, the debrief. Thank you to our guests, John Micklethwait and Sir Nigel Wilson. And all of you listening and sitting here, please do subscribe to Voternomics wherever you listen to podcasts or indeed listen to panels like this one. Thank you very much.